Hi, Dinosaur Bob here. In the last installment, we learned about the creator of worlds and how the world of Cartyrion itself came to be. Today, we're going to be learning about some of the peoples of that world, in particular, the peoples that make up the races or ancestries that our players are going to be using to select their player characters. So let's get started. We're going to start by listening to the old Elven Lorekeeper, who's explaining the nature of the gods.
Just as there are many races on Cartyrion, there are many races that inhabit the outer planes as well. We call these the Astralar. And just as there are greater and lesser members of each race here on Cartyrion, leaders and followers, those with power and knowledge, and those content with just getting by. So too is it with the Astralar. The greatest of all the Astralar is, of course, the creator of worlds himself. Of the rest, the most capable and ambitious follow the creator of worlds throughout the void, laying claim to worlds he leaves behind him as he travels. Not all of these hail from the celestial planes. There are demonic and diabolic powers among them as well. But in the case of Cartyrion, it was members of the four celestial Astralar races that arrived earliest and began their work. Berdea and Altazana of the Alavar, Goranin and Trudana of the Dwagnar, Vorik and Gara of the Gabnar, and Perminion and Karanalin of the Humanar.
Now that we know where the gods and goddesses have come from, and we've heard the names of some of the important ones, let's start to take a look at the mark or impact that these gods have had on Cartyrion. We're going to go back to the Elven Lorekeeper first to get part of the story.
Berdea and Altazana of the Alavar were the first to arrive some 20,000 turns of the seasons ago. Berdea, seeing the broad expanse of rock and sea left by the creator of worlds, decided that he would bring beauty into this place. He first made the grasses and trees and flowers and all the green things that grow on the land and in the shallow seas. He covered the land with his work in most places, but amid the mighty mountains and golden deserts, he left the original labors of the creator of worlds to remain as they were. Then, because he saw beauty in motion as well as form, he awoke the creatures that live in the seas and marshes, the creatures large and small that inhabit the forests and plains, and the birds, bats, and insects that inhabit the skies. His mate Altazana awakened beings that would watch over her partner's work and enjoy their beauty. She formed the Dryads to watch over the forests and great trees, the Lemaniads to tend the flowers and the meadows and plains, and the Naiads to watch over the rivers and pools of fresh water. The Nereids were created to watch over the larger seas, and the Oreads to watch over the mountains. She created the pixies and sprites to live in the gardens made by Berdea all over Cartyrion. But when they were finished, they were not satisfied. Their work was beautiful, but more was needed. And so Father Berdea and Mother Altazana brought us, the elves, to Cartyrion. Our first elven fathers and mothers were awakened in the deepest, greenest forest, the most beautiful part of Alavar's work, the forest we still call Elvenhome. And we were given two great gifts, a deep appreciation for natural beauty and an inquisitiveness to seek it out in many forms. Most of our folk choose to live out their long lives amid the beauty of the forests, either Elvenhome itself or places that resembled it. Others traveled in search of other beauty. Some found it in the seas. A few saw beauty in the cold starkness of the far north and far south. Still, others found a strange beauty in dark places under the mountains. And there have always been some who choose to make their own dwellings within the plains and along the shores of the seas, or choose to wander rather than settle as to experience as much of Cartyrion's beauty as possible. Mother Altazana has touched all her children with special gifts so they may fully enjoy their chosen surroundings.
So, now we have the elves. We know we're going to need to identify a place on the map called Elvenhome. And we also know that we're going to be populating different types of regions and different terrains with different types of elves. Let's take a look at the types of elves that we're going to have. Of course, we're going to have forest elves. What would a fantasy RPG be without them? But we also are going to add something called homekeeper elves. This is a special group that traces a pure ancestry back to the first elves that were awakened at Elvenhome. We'll have cave elves and snow elves. These should be pretty self-explanatory for now. We're going to have sea elves. Not sure how adapted to the sea they're going to be, but we don't have to worry about that just yet. We're going to have something called free elves. These are the ones that seem to be happiest either living among the other peoples, but they might also be the ones that end up populating some of the plains and deserts and other areas that elves aren't normally in. And finally, we're going to create something called the touched elves. These are elves with a special link to the magic and the energies that created Cartyrion and hold it together. They can be found pretty much anywhere. We're not going to get into any details on these subtypes right now, but when we do, we're going to try to match them up as best we can with the SRD content from the two major RPG sources that we want Cartyrion to be compatible with. All right, that's enough elf for now. Let's now move on. We're going to listen to the Dwarven Loremaster as he teaches young dwarves where they came from.
For 1,000 winters, the elves were the masters of Cartyrion, but eventually the Dwagnar arrived, led by Goranin and Trudana. You see, the immortal Ashlar do not sense the passage of time the same way we mortals do, so their 1,000 years seem to be a bit of a brief time for the Ashlar. Goranin saw the green forests and plains and fey creatures created by the elf gods, but he was not impressed. You see, to the Dwagnar, the greatest beauty is not in the wispy green leaves and blades of grass. It exists in the strength and durability of solid rock, the glitter and shine of gemstones, and the luster of refined metals. So, Goranin decided to create folk that would also appreciate this beauty. So he chose the most rugged region untouched by the elf gods, and under the tallest peaks of Cartyrion, he made us dwarves to first awaken. His mate Trudana, like all Dwagnar, shared Goranin's appreciation for the beauties of the mountains, but she also had a fancy for intricately crafted mechanisms and artwork. She tried to teach these skills to our fathers and mothers, but let's be honest, we dwarves are not known for our finesse. So, Trudana put her own mark on Cartyrion by awakening our cousins, the gnomes. Smaller and frailer than we, for sure, but most dexterous as well. They were good students, as Trudana taught them the secrets of finely detailed craftsmanship. And they were smart. Our little cousins have cobbled together some remarkable things in their time. He taught our ancestors how to mine the earth, how to refine the ores, how to shape the gemstones, and how to forge the metals taken from the mountain's deepest roots. For a time, dwarf and gnome lived together under the mountains where we were first awakened, but it wasn't long before we began to explore the other regions of mountainous riches spread across the world. For the most part, our folk did not find much attraction in the green open spaces of the world. We cared little for the fey folk and elves, and they had little care for us. There were always new mountains to delve into, so we tended not to linger. But some of the gnomes were taken by the beauty of the gardens tended by the fey, and decided to stay among them and make new homes there. And so while dwarf and gnome still plied their crafts side by side beneath the high peaks, the gnomes have also spread to the forests and glades and learned to craft with materials found there as well. Some of their craft even found favour with the elves, and the children of the Elvar learned gemcraft and fine metalwork from Trudana's children. This is not to say that all dwarves live beneath the tall peaks, of course. There have always been some that seek their fortunes in other places, and since the rise of human folk, a great many have found fortune and friendship among those people. But to this day, no dwarf is happy unless he has solid ground beneath his feet and a tankard of ale in his hand.
Okay, now we know that we need to place major dwarven works beneath the biggest peaks of the world, and we should plan on spreading dwarves out anywhere there are mountains. By the way, not all of those original dwarven works are going to need to be populated. Some might be ruins, some might be great places for adventure, We'll deal with that later. We're also going to need to make accommodations, though, for some dwarves to be scattered elsewhere, beyond the mountains, though most likely not in the deepest forests. To do this, we're going to define 7 subtypes of dwarves. Mountain and hill dwarves, they're the archetypical dwarves that we all know and love. Firstborn dwarves will be those in the original citadels that can trace their ancestries back to the first awakened dwarves, much like the Homekeeper elves. We're going to have Tombkeeper dwarves. These are dwarves responsible for keeping the resting places of their forefathers undisturbed. They're also going to be a source of a lot of dwarven lore. Finally, we'll add Craftmaster, Seafarer, and Wanderer dwarves. These are the ones that will most likely be found out and about among the other peoples of the world, though there will likely be craftmasters in the old dwarven citadels as well. We also learned about the gnomes and their preferences for living locations. By the way, you'll notice that I connected the gnomes to the dwarves and not to the fae like some other RPGs do. This might make things interesting when we start working on their details later, but for now, let's just deal with the subtypes and where they'll be found. First of all, we'll have forest gnomes and mountain gnomes. No real explanation needed there. We're going to have explorer and traveler gnomes. These are the free spirit types that wander anywhere. They're going to be found among other peoples and pretty much any place we want to put them. We'll have architect gnomes. These are the inventive, tinker type gnomes that we all know and love. They also can be found anywhere among other peoples, but also among gnome conclaves as well. We're going to have Lorekeeper gnomes. They're similar to the architects, but they're more thinkers than builders, and they're going to be the inquisitive and really magic-oriented ones. And finally, we're going to add spirit gnomes. This is an offshoot of the forest gnomes that have actually been touched by the fae spirits, and might be a little more like what some other game players are used to for gnomes. As with the elves, most of the entries on these 2 lists are actually going to align with the SRDs from other games, but there's some new ones that we threw in, and there'll be a little bit of variety. All right, that's enough with the dwarves and the gnomes. Now let's move on to the next group of peoples that were placed on Cartyrion, the goblins, and we'll listen to the Goblin Tale-teller as he entertains his clans with the story of how they came to be.
Right, so, we were told that 2,000 years after the first elves walked into the forest, and 1,000 years after the first dwarf struck stone with hammer, the makers of our kind, Vorik and Gara of the Gabnar, arrived on Cartyrion. The Gabnar weren't really appreciated by the other Ashtalar. They say it's because Gabnar were ugly, or crude, or impulsive, or all 3. But we knew they were just simply jealous. Vorik and Gara wanted to be seen as equals of the Alavar and the Dwagnar, but they were ignored. So, rather than being lonely, they decided to awaken the first goblins so we could accept them and honor them. They thought that if the elves and dwarves could see the goblin folk were as good as they were, then Vorik and Gara would be accepted by the other Ashtalar. So, Vorik woke some of our forefathers in the mountains to be near the dwarves and gnomes, and some in the forests and glens to be near the elves. But the dwarves thought of our forefathers to be small and weak. Most just laughed at us, but there were a few that tried to be nice. It was the same with the elves. Most called us ugly and avoided us, but there was always some that would make friends with us. And Vorik and Gara made us to believe that as long as there's a chance that we can be equals, we should try and not mess it up. And we should keep trying to prove it we're as good as the others. The gnomes weren't so bad. Maybe they were laughed at by the dwarves too, so they knew how we felt. The gnomes even taught our first parents how to make things, pretty things and useful things. And when the humans and halflings came along sometime later, they accepted us a little better. But it was never enough for Vorik and Gara. That being said, Vorik decided to try again, to awaken more children that would be better accepted, and he made our big cousins, the hobgoblins. Dwarves didn't call them weak, but the hobgoblins got a little bit of Vorik's resentment built into their nature, so they tended to be bullies and hard to get along with, so the results weren't much different. To the elves, they were just bigger, uglier things. Gara tried again too, and she tried to at least fix what the elves called ugly. She thought the best way to do this was to pick the best features of the creatures the elves seemed to like and put them all together. The result was the bugbears. This didn't work out either, but yeah, The elves thought the bugbears were horrible abominations of Berdea's original beauty. Oops. So, now the only place a Gabi can be sure to be accepted is among other Gabis. Even our bigger cousins, the Hobbies and the Buggies, tend to push us around a lot and don't appreciate us. Our brothers and sisters are all over the world in all sorts of places. And everywhere we go, we'll keep trying to prove that we're useful, that we're smart, and that we belong. 'Cause that's what we Gabbies are all about.
We've learned that the goblins will be pretty much everywhere, but probably not in great concentrations. More important, we've learned a little bit about how they're going to interact with the other player races, how they like to be seen, how they like to be accepted, and so forth. We also learned a little bit about how they interact with the few races that, for now at least, are not player choosable. We're going to pick our goblin subtypes not so much based on the terrain they live in, but on the lifestyles that they've chosen to develop into in various clans over time. One exception to that will be the Frosty Goblin. Those are terrain based, and they're going to be based in the far north and the far south, and any place where the terrain is mostly snow covered most of the year. Beyond those, we're going to have goblin subtypes like the Fireworker, who've learned to play with fire and do cool things with fire, and you can figure out where that could end up. We have the Forager Goblin. They've learned to live on pretty much anything and everything. If it's remotely organic, they can eat it. We have the Hunter Goblin. They've learned to rely on their natural weaponry to become very good at taking down game and fending for themselves. We will have the Ironbone Goblin. These are the ones that have, for whatever reason, have gotten pretty hardy, and they're definitely harder to kill. They survive a lot of things that most things their size shouldn't survive, but oh well. We're going to have the Tinker Goblins. These are the rather inventive ones, the creative ones. They've learned to create tools and rely on tools. They're definitely not as intricate and exotic as the kind of things that gnomes can make, but they're functional and they get by. And finally, we have the Vagabond Goblins, and these are the ones that just basically wander around, doing what they can, trying to fit in somewhere with somebody somehow. As before, a lot of these line up actually with the source SRDs that we're thinking about, but some of them are new as well. Okay, our last stop today is back to the Old Human Storyteller, the one who told us the story of Cartyrion in the first place. He's going to tell us where the human race on this world came from, and not only the humans, but the halflings as well.
Ah, you returned. Well, now that you're here, I may as well tell you a bit of our story. The last of the major Ashtalar to arrive at Cartyrion were the Humanar. About 2,000 years after the goblins first awoke, so some 16,000 years ago by this point, Prominion and Caronalyn arrived and looked upon the works of those who came before. The Humanar are beings that prize ambition, industry, and accomplishment, and as they looked about Cartyrion, they did not see much to impress them. The children of the Alavar spent too much time simply admiring the beauty around them, and while the children of the Dwagnar were certainly industrious, they spent too much time doing their work and not enough time enjoying the fruits of their labors. The children of the Gobnar were industrious too, but they didn't seem to have any real purpose behind their work. So they decided to awaken children of their own upon Cartyrion, and thus the humans came to be. Prominion instilled in us an ambition to explore and expand their presence in the world, and Caronalyn gave us a drive and desire to improve ourselves and leave things better for our children. We were made as creatures of balanced opposites, a spirit of competition and self-improvement tempered by a willingness to cooperate for the greater good. But whether we're working as individuals or a group, we keep our eyes on the reward and enjoy a job well done. Caronalyn wasn't quite finished, though. She felt that even we humans were a bit too ambitious and impatient, much like the goblins among us. So, she herself awakened a race very much like us, but more focused on the goals of comfort, and much like us, Caronion made them smaller in hopes that this would curb the urge to compete excessively and strengthen their spirit of cooperation. And if you've ever seen a halfling go at a plate of food and a tankard of ale, you would agree she succeeded.
So humans are pretty much everywhere, and they tend to live in groups, in villages, towns, cities, communities of that sort. The halflings will also be living almost everywhere and anywhere, and they also are going to tend to live in some sort of community settings. Many times these will be the same communities as the humans, although we were also certainly going to have some situations where we have human-only settlements and some where we have halfling-only settlements. Now let's start to take a look at human subtypes. And here's where we run into our first real discrepancy between the two SRDs that we're dealing with. There are two groups of people that are treated very, very differently in the two gaming systems that we're kind of targeting here. And those groups are half-elves and half-orcs. One gaming system basically treats each of those as a completely separate race and handles them entirely as if they were just like dwarves, elves, etc. The other one treats them as human subtypes. Well, I've looked at both, and the fact is the end result is going to be pretty much the same no matter how we do this, if we do our jobs right. So I'm going to take the human subtype approach, and we're going to make our first two subtypes of humans half-orcs and half-elves. You might ask whether we should have half-dwarves and half-halflings as well. Let's leave that for a future time to think about. I like this approach, and by the way, this same approach also defines two other subtypes of humans that are based not so much, again, on definitely not on geography, but on human tendencies. And I'm going to go with those two subtypes as well. One of them is the specialist type. I'm not quite sure what we're going to call it yet, but these are the types that tend to pick one area of expertise and get very, very good at it. That could be any area of expertise, though, whether it's physical crafting or knowledge or some skill. It can be anything, but they're going to get to pick one. And the other type is the jack of all trades type. They're not particularly excellent at anything, but they can get by in just about everything. And that defines a lot of humans. We are going to add a fifth subtype of human, though, and that is the noble-born. And that's because, let's face it, every RPG game we play has nobles in it. Nobles live different than the common folk. They deserve their own subtype. Now let's take a look at the subtypes we're going to have for halflings. Some of these are terrain-based or geography-based, and some are not. The terrain-based ones include the Gloomwalker. These are halflings that actually prefer to live possibly in caves or in dark areas. They've gotten very, very good at functioning at night. They might live in towns and cities as well, but they've learned to adapt well to working in low light situations, shall we say. And you can imagine the sorts of jobs that they might end up with in towns and cities, as well as in caves. We will have the Darkwood halflings. These are halflings that prefer to live in the deep forest. They're not going to be farmers. They're probably going to be pretty good hunters. They might make good rangers, that sort of thing. They just prefer the quiet dark and the beauty of the deep green. We will have the pastoral halflings. These are our typical farmer halflings or suburban halflings, if you will. The sort of halflings that Tolkien made popular. They're also the ones that are probably, if any, going to be found in large groups of just halflings. It might be these guys. We're going to have the townie halflings. The townies actually prefer to live in the cities and towns, among the humans especially. They like the hustle and bustle and activity of the cities. And you can imagine the sort of jobs that they're going to end up with. Next, we have the free spirit halflings. These are the real wanderers, the real exception to the typical halfling lifestyle. They're the ones that would rather not just settle down and be happy. They want to go out and see the world. We have the dauntless halflings. These are the leaders. These are the ones that are the bold adventurers. Though, although not every adventurer player character needs to be a dauntless halfling, but these are the ones that have a tendency to sometimes think they're 2 feet taller and a little bit stronger than they really are, and that might get them into trouble from time to time. But they're good at getting out of that trouble as well. And finally, we have the collector halfling. The collector halfling is again like every other halfling. They live for comfort, but their idea of comfort is to have really, really cool stuff around them. Some of them collect knowledge, some of them collect things, some of them collect shiny things, some of them collect expensive shiny things. So again, you can start to imagine what sort of jobs these guys might tend toward. And that's pretty much it for the peoples, or at least the player character peoples of the world of Cartyrion. Before moving on, though, I should note that some of the stories that we heard have also given us another important bit of information, and that is the age of Cartyrion and the amount of time that the races have had to make their mark on the world. We were told that life first came to be at least 20,000 years ago, and that life about 20,000 years ago included the elves. 1,000 years later came the dwarves and gnomes, and 1,000 years after that, the goblins, and 2,000 years after that, the humans and halflings. So humankind has been around for about 16,000 years. They've had that long to spread and to build. That's plenty of time for empires to rise and fall, plenty of time for us to be able to create a rich history and folklore and all sorts of runes and all sorts of adventures and that sort of thing. If you think about the fact that most of recorded human civilization on Earth has taken place inside a 6,000 year span, 16,000 years should be plenty of time for us to play with. All right, now before we wrap things up and discuss plans for the next installments, we're going to listen to the storyteller one more time, just to give us some idea about some of the other races and some of the other things that we might be dealing with as we come along, and also a hint to some of the other gods and goddesses that we might be dealing with in the future.
And so, in time, other Astralar would find their way to Cartyrion, and would make their marks upon the peoples of the world. Some came simply to adopt followers from the existing peoples, sometimes by teaching them new skills and talents, other times by subtly altering their natures. Some, like the Orokar and the Dragonar, would awaken new races both above and below the surfaces of the world. Others not quite as powerful would uplift the nature of some of Buradea's simpler creatures to bring about awareness and a desire to revere and serve as their new guardians. Some came thousands of years ago, and others arrived more recently. There may be still more arriving as this tale is being told, but the stories of those beings and their followers are for another time.
So now we know that over time, we have a mythological basis for introducing new races to Cartyrion. Of course, we knew that we'd have to be adding things like orcs and dragons. I guess you figured that out from the clip of the storyteller. It wouldn't be a fantasy RPG without orcs and dragons. But we also introduced the concept of having some members of the original player races twisted into new things by newly arriving Astralar. Perhaps elves, dwarves, and gnomes that ventured deeper into the earth than their kin recommended, and they were changed by things they found there. Perhaps some of the fey sprites and pixies were reshaped into nastier things by some of the nastier Astralar. Each new monster deserves a backstory, and for now we've at least laid the groundwork of how those backstories can fit into our mythology. Before we get into any of those, though, we're going to go back to the task at hand, which is populating Cartyrion. Now that we know who we're placing, and we've got a general idea of where, we need to go back to the maps and actually place things down, start to put things down on the maps and develop the maps that are going to form the basis of our adventures and the basis of everything else we do on Cartyrion. So before I go, I want to first of all apologize for my cracking voice. I've just gotten over a bit of a cold. I was hoping I was a little farther over it than I am, but I didn't want to wait any longer to get this video out. But I'm dealing with it, so you'll have to too. And that's about it for now. Until next time, may the dice be with you.